There are plays that end with applause, and others that leave only silence behind. When a famous judge collapses at a private dinner, it seems like the final act has already played out. But in a world where lies wear costumes and truth waits in the wings, nothing is ever quite what it seems. This isn't just a case of murder. It's a script written in secrets, and every guest had a role. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. It was a Thursday, late enough in the morning for Wolfe to be nestled among his orchids, and for me to be on the street running errands that didn't require a 7-seater sedan or a holster. That particular errand was cheese. Fritz had circled a name in La Gastronomie Moderne with a look that bordered on religious experience, a soft, triple cream French import he insisted would pair with the trout we weren't yet having. Wolfe, of course, had dispatched me with the efficiency of a general sending a corporal over the top. I was just stepping out of Del Genaro's, balancing a modest parcel that smelled like it would start arguments, when a man brushed up beside me. Grey coat, narrow shoulders, discreet shoes, the uniform of someone who doesn't want to be remembered. "Mr. Goodwin?" he asked. His voice was clean as a scalpel. "That's the rumour," I said. He handed me an envelope, cream-coloured, sealed with wax, and heavier than it looked. No name, just one word printed in strong, upright letters. "Urgent." "No reply required," he said. "The sender trusts in discretion." Before I could clarify whose discretion was being trusted, he was gone, into a cab that pulled off like it had better places to be. I looked at the envelope. It wasn't perfume, and it wasn't threat, but it wasn't cheese either, which meant it was about to become Wolfe's problem. Back at the brownstone, the cheese went to Fritz with a minimum of ceremony, and I retired to my desk with the envelope still sealed. Wolfe didn't emerge from the orchid rooms until noon sharp, which gave me time to consider whether the mystery of its contents outweighed the pleasure of irritating him with them. I opened it. Inside was a single card, heavy stock, copperplate handwriting, just formal enough to feel dangerous. The message was short. "Midnight, 17 Gramercy Place, 5 guests. Bring Mr. Wolfe. Discretion absolute." No signature, no explanation, no RSVP option. I stared at the card for a good long minute. Gramercy Place wasn't a bad address if you liked your scandal in whispers and your money inherited. 5 guests suggested dinner. Midnight suggested something less edible. The fact that they wanted Wolfe, not the police, not a priest, and certainly not a lawyer, gave it flavour. I tapped it against the desk. Wolfe didn't like flavour, not in mystery. He liked clarity. Still, I had a feeling this was going to smell stronger than the cheese. By the time I delivered the card into Wolfe's pudgy hands, he was seated at his desk surrounded by the orderly clutter that only looked like chaos if you didn't know the man. He took one glance at the handwriting and let the corner of his lip twitch, which for Wolfe was high drama. "Midnight," he said, as though the word offended him personally. "Uncivilized." 5 guests, I offered. "Could be an even 6 if you bring a sense of humour." He ignored that. The assumption that I would go gallivanting about Manhattan at such an hour is preposterous and presumptuous. Also intriguing. Pfui. I set the card down on the edge of his desk, where it sat like a challenge. He didn't touch it again. "This is not a summons, Archie. It is a baited hook, which makes me the trout. You, at worst, are the worm." I shrugged and leaned against the credenza. "So we're declining?" "We," he said with a level gaze, "are not doing anything. You may, if you wish, squander your evening chasing ghosts." I wished. Not because of the ghosts, but because Wolfe, for once, looked uneasy. The card gave no name, but the envelope had a return address in minuscule, almost reluctant script, 17 Gramercy Place. Manhattan's map is full of pretty lies, but Gramercy doesn't tell stories. It keeps them. I rang. The voice that answered was older, crisp, and English in the way that suggests a governess and a locked cabinet of sherry. I introduced myself, and the line went quiet. Then, as if descending from a private tower, came the reply. "This is Millicent Vale." That name wasn't quite a bell, but it was definitely a chime, something from a college syllabus or the back cover of a first edition. Novelist, reclusive, controversial, possibly mad. "I'd like to request a consultation," she said, "before tonight." I glanced at the clock. "With Mr. Wolfe?" "With both of you, if possible, but you'll do." That sounded familiar. We agreed on 2:30. I put down the phone and pulled out the office file. Millicent Vale had vanished from the literary world sometime after Truman got elected. But someone had kept her in print, and somebody else had just sent her a corpse in the mail. She arrived promptly at 2:25 in a coat that had once cost someone a month's rent and eyes that didn't match anything else she was wearing. Her hair was pinned with unnecessary care, her gloves were spotless, and her voice had the cultivated rasp of bourbon taken from a crystal decanter rather than a bottle. Millicent Vale, in person, was not what her author photos had promised. She was sharper now and less airbrushed. Her fame had aged, but not disappeared. "I presume," she said without sitting, "you've read the invitation?" Wolfe didn't rise. "I have seen it." "Then you know I require your presence." "I do not go out." She offered the ghost of a smile. "Then you will miss something terrible." Wolfe raised a brow. "An event you were planning?" "No," she said. "An event I've foreseen. There is a difference." That made him grunt, which in Wolfe speak was halfway to interest. She went on, "I have invited 5 individuals to my home tonight. Each of them has wronged me. Some of them know it. One of them—" She paused. "One of them may have killed before." Wolfe leaned back. "Madam, vengeance is not a legal commodity." She sat then, very calmly. "This isn't about vengeance, Mr. Wolfe. It's about recognition. I need someone in the room who understands when the curtain rises." I looked at Wolfe. He was frowning, which meant he understood too well. For a long moment after she'd finished, Wolfe said nothing. He rested his fingertips together and regarded her as he might a curious beetle that had wandered onto an orchid. "Miss Vale," he said at last, "what you are proposing is theatre. An evening of calculated emotional exhibition. You have baited a trap, not with money, but with memory." "I've baited nothing," she said coolly. "I've offered a setting. What occurs within it is not under my control." "Pfui," Wolfe said. "Control is your oxygen." I couldn't help admiring that one. She didn't flinch. "You believe," he continued, "that assembling your enemies will induce a moment of spontaneous truth. You are wrong. What you will provoke at best is performance." "I've lived my life in performance," she replied. "But tonight, someone else will break character." Wolfe's lip curled faintly. "I have no interest in amateur drama, however fatal." She rose. "Then you'll read about it in the morning." She left without another word. Wolfe didn't speak again until the elevator groaned into motion. Then, softly, "She wants a witness. But someone else may want an ending." Wolfe had spoken his verdict, which was, by the unspoken law of the brownstone, also mine, except when it wasn't. There are times a man knows when something's going to sour, and there are times when he knows the sour's already in the milk. This was the second kind. Wolfe might dismiss Miss Vale's prophecy as melodrama, but I'd seen enough murder start with less. So around 11:15 that night, while Wolfe was still pretending to read Pliny the Elder and Fritz was doing terrible things to turnips, I changed my shirt, grabbed my coat, and left a note that said, "Back before dawn, if not dead. A." The taxi to Gramercy was uneventful, unless you count my reflection in the window, wondering why I was about to walk into someone else's private reckoning. But the invitation had been issued. The guests were gathering, and someone, somewhere, was warming up for their entrance. I had a seat, a view, and a card that said I was expected. At precisely midnight, the butler, an older man who looked like he'd once trained diplomats in silence, closed the parlour doors behind us with a click that didn't echo. The room was as curated as a museum: candlelight, heavy drapes, books with unread spines. The 5 guests had arrived, and I'd been introduced as an observer. No one asked what I was observing. Everyone knew. There was a toast. Millicent lifted a glass, and the others followed suit, though no one smiled. The wine was good, the tension better, and then, as the glasses lowered, one of them slipped, a crystal flute, striking the floor with a sharp, startled crack. A man whose name I will record later bent to pick it up. As he rose, he said it, quietly, not to the room, not to himself, but to the air, like a line spoken too late in a scene gone wrong. "We're not all leaving here alive." The others froze. Millicent didn't blink, and somewhere in the distance the chime of a long case clock struck once, 12 times. Midnight had arrived, and the play had begun. If there's a right way to walk into someone else's private opera, I haven't learned it. But when I arrived at 17 Gramercy Place that evening, I knew 2 things before the door opened. I was overdressed for a mugging and underinformed for a séance. The townhouse was 5 stories of literary silence, with ivy on the facade and secrets behind the brick. The butler, whose expression had been polished to a reflective neutrality, let me in without comment. The interior smelled of polished wood, fading books, and the kind of perfume that only comes from old money and older memory. The parlour was a composition in dim gold, no overhead light, just table lamps, antique sconces, and one commanding portrait of a younger Millicent Vale that watched the room like a disappointed matriarch. It wasn't a home, not in the real sense. It was staging. Everything had been placed to draw the eye, to shape the mood. Millicent wasn't expecting a casual dinner. She was expecting revelation. And I wasn't the only actor invited to the performance. The house had 5 chairs set out with surgical precision, and I had the distinct impression that one of them would remain empty before the night was done. The guests arrived one by one, and each entry felt rehearsed, not by them, maybe, but by Millicent, whose unseen hand seemed to adjust the temperature of the room as if turning a dial behind a curtain. The first was Leo Hawthorne, theatrical to the bone. He offered a bow instead of a handshake and took his seat as though auditioning for King. His hair was swept back like a matinee idol's, and his eyes swept the room with casual contempt. Next came Dr. Constance Harrow, crisp navy suit, pearl pin, and a gaze that had been trained to diagnose before you finished blinking. She didn't look at anyone directly, but you felt her evaluation like a hand on your throat. Seth Vale arrived with the smoothness of someone who had borrowed his suit and was prepared to charm it back. He was too polished, too pleased, and had the vague sheen of money that belonged to someone else. Then came Greta Lawson. She was younger, quieter, the kind of woman who didn't enter a room so much as slide into its margins. But her eyes, they were watching, always watching. Judge Redford Ellison came last, which felt appropriate. He had the gravity of a man used to listening in silence until it was time to pass sentence. The room dipped slightly when he entered, or maybe that was just the blood pressure of everyone else. Millicent Vale appeared only after her guests were seated, which told me everything I needed to know about her preferred position in any story, omniscient, offstage, and always one beat ahead. She glided, and I don't use the term lightly, into the parlour, trailing satin and a silence that asked for reverence. She offered no apologies for lateness. She didn't need to. What she did offer was choreography. She adjusted a lamp without asking. She turned the music down by 1 notch. She called for wine with a nod so subtle that the butler seemed to vanish before I'd seen him move. She introduced no one. Instead, she drifted between chairs with calculated casualness, letting everyone's gaze adjust to the presence of everyone else. Her eyes never lingered, but her attention did. She was watching, yes, but more than that. She was listening for friction, waiting for it to spark. And if the tension in the room had weight, it was her hand on the scale. Millicent raised her glass without preamble. "To memory?" she said. They followed suit, though I caught hesitation in at least 3 wrists. Crystal chimed, but the sound had a minor chord in it. Leo Hawthorne went first. "To the written word," he said, "and those who wield it without mercy." That drew a half-smile from Millicent. Greta murmured something too low to catch, but she drank, then coughed. Not from the wine, but from what she was trying not to say. Dr. Harrow's toast was clinical. To resilience, psychological, literary, and otherwise. Seth Vales came with a wink. To reunions, and to the past, where most of this evening seems to be living. The judge lifted his glass last. To truth, he said. No matter how delayed. I didn't have a glass, which suited me just fine. I was there to observe. And what I saw wasn't a celebration. It was a trial without charges, a eulogy without a corpse. The only one enjoying it was Millicent, and even she looked like she was waiting for a bell to ring. They didn't need name tags. Each of them had been footnoted in Millicent's career, as obstacles, antagonists, or accomplices. Leo had once directed the ill-fated stage adaptation of her second novel. It ran 4 nights before collapsing under legal threats and whispered blackmail. Dr. Harrow had been her confidant-turned-publisher-endorsed evaluator. A psychiatric memoir nearly surfaced and nearly destroyed her. Seth had threatened to sue her over estate mismanagement. The suit didn't stick, but the story did. Greta's name surfaced only after the wine had loosened tongues. She'd written an anonymous review of Millicent's last book, the one that didn't make it to shelves. Scathing, precise, and published without attribution. But Millicent had known, she always knew. And the judge, well, he'd banned one of Millicent's novels from public schools in 1947. On moral grounds, that sort of insult doesn't get buried. It gets aged, decanted, and served back cold. Millicent had chosen her cast carefully, not just enemies, not just ghosts. She'd invited people who had touched her reputation and left fingerprints. The dining room was candlelit, absurdly quiet, and just warm enough to ensure no one could blame a shiver on the draft. Each course arrived with timing that suggested the butler had been briefed by a metronome. Conversation, however, danced with less grace. Leo recounted a play he hadn't written. Seth praised a Paris gallery he hadn't visited. Greta made a soft comment about narrative structure, which the judge ignored. Harrow dissected the psychological implications of asparagus. Millicent did not eat much. She watched. Every statement was a sidestep. Every compliment sounded like it had a second clause hiding under the parsley. And through it all, a single, shared awareness pulsed beneath the surface. They hadn't gathered here by chance. They hadn't come for reconciliation. They had come, or been summoned, for something to be revealed, or revoked. I'd attended stranger dinners, but few, where every bite came with a question mark and the cutlery felt ceremonial. By the time the 3rd course was cleared and the port began to make its discreet rounds, Judge Ellison cleared his throat. "If you'll excuse me," he said to no one in particular, "I need a moment." Millicent inclined her head. "Of course, Judge." He rose slowly, adjusting his cuffs. I noticed his shoulders were tight, not the way they'd been when he walked in. This was different. Not dignity, tension. He left the dining room with quiet steps. I counted them out of habit. 11 to the stairwell. Another 7 above, muffled by the runner. Conversation resumed, but with less enthusiasm. And without him the table felt unbalanced, as though one leg had suddenly shortened. Millicent didn't mention his absence, neither did anyone else. 10 minutes later he hadn't returned. 15, and the port had begun to settle into the glasses untouched. I gave it 5 more. Then I stood, excused myself with a nod that was met by none, and took the stairs. The second-floor hallway was long and still. The guest lavatory door was shut. I knocked once. "Judge Ellison?" Nothing. I knocked again. No cough, no flush, no reply. I tried the knob. Locked from the inside. That's when the silence became something else, not absence, but resistance. I leaned close and listened, and what I heard was exactly what you don't want to hear behind a locked door. Nothing. I returned downstairs and tapped Seth on the shoulder. "Your uncle's locked in and not answering." He paled, genuinely. I'll give him that. Together we went back up. I knocked once more, louder, still nothing. The butler, summoned with a glance from Millicent, produced a narrow brass key with no comment. Seth turned it, then hesitated. "You should—" I opened the door. Judge Ellison was seated neatly on the edge of the tub, hands resting on his knees, eyes wide and glassy. No blood, no disarray, just stillness, polished and final. His lips were parted slightly as though waiting to speak. The rest of his body had no such intention. There was no sign of struggle, no object out of place, just a man who had excused himself from dinner and from everything else. And somewhere behind us, the party continued. It was 20 minutes past midnight when the house at Gramercy Place officially stopped being a stage and became a crime scene. The judge sat where we'd found him, as cold as he was dignified, and the rest of us were corralled like sheep with alibis. The first officer on site tried to maintain a veneer of procedure, but once Inspector Kramer stepped through the front door, in a hat that looked sleep-deprived and a suit that smelled like wool and wrath, that evaporated fast. He was scowling before I said a word, which put us ahead of schedule. "You again," he grunted, eyeing me like I was a half-eaten sandwich someone had left on a subway bench. "Evening, Inspector," I said. "Or morning, if you're pedantic." He didn't rise to it. He turned toward the hallway, jerked a thumb at one of his men and barked, "No one leaves!" The butler started to explain something, but Kramer waved him off. His eyes landed on me again. "Where's Wolfe?" "At home, dreaming of fungus." "Then wake him, because unless he gets his fat self involved, I'm putting you on the suspect list." That seemed excessive, even for Kramer. By 2 a.m., the coroner had done enough poking and prodding to confirm what everyone else already knew. Judge Ellison was dead. What made things less agreeable was that he had apparently died without a reason. "No wounds," the man muttered, peeling off a latex glove like it had betrayed him. "No contusions, no abrasions, nothing snapped or ruptured, and no signs of cardiac trauma." "Poison?" Kramer asked, looming like a question mark with fists. "We'll need toxicology for that, but there's no vomit, no froth, no blistering." "You trying to tell me this man just sat down and forgot how to breathe?" The coroner didn't answer that directly. He looked at me instead, which wasn't comforting. "We found a glass on the sink edge, half full. Same port as at dinner, we think. No residue? None visible, no scent." Kramer grunted again, then turned to me with a look that suggested I had personally mixed the drink. "You were where?" "Downstairs, not near the glass." "Convenient." I could have told him convenience was never my strong suit, but I figured it wasn't the moment for wit. By the time the coroner packed up his kit and vanished like a magician who'd flubbed a trick, Kramer had narrowed his list of suspects to one: me. He stood in the foyer, jabbing a finger like it owed him rent. "You were here? You weren't announced? You don't have a formal invitation?" "I have the card," I said. "I'm sentimental like that." He ignored it. "You had access. You had motive. You're always underfoot when something goes wrong." "Only when you're nearby," I said. "Coincidence, not causality." He wasn't amused. "Goodwin, I've had you in my hair for 12 years. One of these days I'm going to stop giving you the benefit of Wolfe's reputation." I smiled. "I'll have Fritz prepare a eulogy." But, truth be told, I didn't like the direction this was headed. Kramer wasn't bluffing. and my fingerprints were probably on the banister, the glassware, and the judge's list of regrets, which meant Wolfe would need to enter the ring. The only trick was getting him off his throne to do it, and that, as always, required the right blend of outrage and insult. By 10 the next morning, the phone had been worn thin by Kramer's attempts to sound reasonable. Wolfe had refused him thrice, once before breakfast, once during breakfast, and once during his daily dictation to Theodore in the orchid room. Each refusal was elegant, articulate, and wrapped in Latin quotation that only added insult to Stonewall. But the fourth time, the inspector came in person. I opened the door, admired the storm cloud parked on our stoop, and waved him inside with the sort of courtesy that barely concealed my satisfaction. Wolfe was at his desk, naturally, and did not rise. "You will sit, or you will fume. The chair is yours, the outrage is not." Kramer sat, but not before slamming a file down with such vigor that Fritz probably flinched in the kitchen. "We got a body, no cause of death, 5 people with motive, and your man in the room. That's enough to hang a case on." "That," Wolfe said dryly, "is enough to justify inquiry, not indictment." "So inquire." Wolfe sighed and tapped the edge of his blotter. "Very well, bring them to me." "You think they'll come?" "They'll come," Wolfe said. "They are actors, and the stage is mine." I refrained from applause. Barely. But I could feel the house lights coming up. The living room had been repurposed for interrogation, Wolfe's version, which didn't involve spotlights or slapping desks, but silence and syntax. The guests sat one at a time, facing the man in the oversized chair with the oversized intellect. I took notes, or pretended to. Mostly I watched them watch him. Dr. Harrow went first. She answered in full sentences, cool and textbook precise. Wolfe let her expound on trauma and displacement until she stepped on the word suggestibility. That's when he pounced. "You believe Judge Ellison was susceptible to influence?" "I believe he was human, Mr. Wolfe." "A platitude." I asked for an analysis. Seth Vale followed, smug and perfumed. He called the judge a tedious relic and called the evening unfortunate. Wolfe asked him if he believed in justice. Seth smirked. "Only when it's profitable." Leo Hawthorne's turn was theatrical, full of alibis with a twist and gestures that had been rehearsed in front of mirrors. Wolfe merely asked, "Have you ever directed a scene in which the victim dies off stage?" Leo blinked. "I don't understand." "Of course not," Wolfe said dryly. Millicent refused to sit. She stood behind the chair and said, "If you're looking for motive, you'll need more than memory." Wolfe inclined his head. "Memory is rarely the problem. It's what people do with it." When the door closed behind the last of them, Wolfe steepled his fingers and stared at a crack in the ceiling as though it might confess. "They're not lying," he said at last. "Not in the traditional sense." "I noticed," I said. "They're improvising." He gave me a brief nod of acknowledgement, which from Wolfe is practically applause. Then he spoke, quietly, but without ambiguity. "This is not murder as the police understand it. It is not born of rage or fear or convenience. It is artifice, deliberate, layered, timed. You're saying it was staged. I'm saying it was staged twice, once for the guests, once for the corpse." I sat forward. "So who's the director?" "That, Archie, is what we must now determine." He didn't say it, but I knew what he was thinking. A man who dies in a locked room without a mark, in the middle of a party designed for revelation. That's not a crime, it's a production, and productions have scripts, even if the final act goes off-book. Wolfe rarely assigns me outdoor work unless it's raining, morally grey, or beneath him. This was all 3. He called it necessary, which meant I had no choice. "Watch them," he said. "Each of them. Particularly after they believe the curtain has closed." "You want curtain calls?" "I want subtext. Their movements, associations, inconsistencies. Find what they didn't say." I spent the next 36 hours sampling the private lives of people who didn't believe in privacy. Greta Lawson visited 2 bookstores and cried behind one of them. Seth made 3 phone calls from a hotel bar and tried to expense all of them. Dr. Harrow attended a conference on dissociation, which felt thematic. Hawthorne rehearsed, drank, and tried to have me followed. He failed. They were nervous. They were hiding. But none of them looked like killers. Then again, Wolfe had said this wasn't a murder, not yet. So I kept watching, because someone was going to break character, and my job was to catch them before the encore. It was just past 11 when I reached Greta Lawson's apartment. I hadn't planned to visit her again that night, but something in her eyes earlier, that sideways glance, brittle and preemptive, had stayed with me like a note out of tune. I rang. No answer. The door was locked, but the light beneath it was too steady. I called her name twice, still nothing. By the time I got the building super to cough up a key, I was telling myself I was overreacting. Wolfe would have said so, but then Wolfe rarely left his chair, and the chair had never walked in on someone slumped beside an open bottle and a folded letter. She was breathing, barely. Not the panic of someone fighting to live, the resignation of someone who'd decided not to. I dialed emergency, gave the address, and waited. While I did, I knelt beside her and tried a name. Hers didn't get a flicker. Then her lips moved. One word, software bitter. Seth. It wasn't a confession, but it wasn't meaningless either. And I had the feeling Wolfe would find that difference critical. Seth Vale didn't leave a note, a call, or a trail. Only a half-packed suitcase and a whisper of cologne that hadn't earned the price tag. The room at the Excelsior was as neat as a boarding school dormitory. Bed made, shirts folded, shoes lined like obedient soldiers. Too neat. There were no signs of forced departure, no spilled drink, no scattered drawers, just one drawer open, the top one where passports and dirty secrets tend to sleep. Empty. The concierge hadn't seen him go. No checkout, no luggage claim, just absence. I stood in the middle of the room and looked around like it owed me an explanation. He hadn't fled in panic. He'd gone somewhere, or been taken, with just enough haste to leave the walls cold and just enough order to make it feel intentional. That was the part I didn't like. The performance of calm. I called Wolfe. "He's gone," I said. "Of course he is," Wolfe replied. "The fish leaves the bowl before the net is visible. The question is, did he jump or was he lifted?" I told him I'd find out. But I didn't like the odds on either option. Greta Lawson was convalescing at a private clinic in Greenwich Village that smelled like linen and resignation. The psychiatrist had the bedside manner of a court clerk and tried to block my visit with a pamphlet. I got in anyway. She was pale but not transparent. She looked at me like she recognized me, but hadn't decided whether that meant I was real. Her voice was hoarse, her hands still, and when she spoke, it wasn't apology that came out. It wasn't meant to go that far. I asked her what that meant. She stared past me, toward a window with drawn curtains. "Seth and I had history. I once published a piece about him, anonymous, an essay, what kind?" "Plagiarism," she said. "He'd lifted half a chapter from an obscure Hungarian novel. I traced it, wrote about it, thought it was over." "Was it?" She shook her head. "I got letters. After? Not legal ones." "Threats?" "Wrapped in compliments," she said. "You're brilliant. You're dangerous. You should disappear." She reached for water, then stopped. I never knew if it was him, but it smelled like him, like borrowed charm and something spoiled underneath. Back at the brownstone, Greta's folder of letters arrived via courier, sealed, labelled, and trembling at the edges. Wolfe didn't touch them. He passed them to me with 2 fingers and an arched brow. The letters were typed, postmarked from 5 cities, unsigned. Each opened with praise, transitioned to unease, and ended with a carefully phrased suggestion that Greta stop writing. Not because she was wrong, because she was right, and because being right, in certain circles, was a blood sport. One line stood out: "You've misunderstood Seth. His brilliance is not theft, it's transformation." Another: "What you revealed was not fraud." It was betrayal. Wolfe read those aloud and sniffed. "This is not the language of rage. It's the language of self-preservation." "Or guilt," I said. He leaned back. "Yes, but whose?" The detail that stuck with me was a postscript on the last letter. "One day you'll understand the price of publication." I folded it carefully. Whoever had written that hadn't wanted silence. They'd wanted obedience. Seth Vale, it seemed, didn't just rewrite fiction. He revised people. Wolfe never leaves the brownstone, but he has ways of going places. Usually, those ways have names, fees, and diplomatic immunity. This time, he used me. "Find out what he was hiding in Paris," he said. "Not the charm, the residue." "Delightful," I said. "You want me to make long-distance calls in French and uncover invisible debts?" "I want you," he replied, "to reveal the substance beneath the performance." "That is what you are best at, Archie." Looking past the surface while pretending not to. "With that modest compliment," I began. By noon, I'd spoken to 2 hotel clerks, one weary expatriate novelist, and a French theatre agent who claimed to have slept with Seth, sued him, and forgiven him, in that order. The pattern was familiar: glamour, seduction, collapse. Seth had run a literary investment scheme that promised translation rights to novels that didn't exist. He had romanced the wife of a minor publisher and walked away just before the scandal turned into ink, and he owed a nightclub pianist enough money to have earned a scar or two. I pieced it together and delivered the report. Wolfe nodded once. "He was not merely opportunistic," Wolfe said. "He was theatrical. He turned duplicity into character." "Are we talking motive?" I asked. "We are talking design," he said. "Seth Vale didn't fear exposure. He feared the loss of control." That, in Wolfe's book, was deadlier than envy or revenge. Millicent returned to the brownstone late that afternoon, wearing black gloves and the expression of someone who had already edited the day in her mind. She declined tea, ignored Fritz's croissants, and sat on the edge of the couch like an exclamation mark. "I thought," she said, "that if I brought them together, the truth would unravel itself." "That," Wolfe said, "is a fantasy." She smiled faintly. "So is fiction. But it's what I know." He regarded her for a moment. "The trouble with summoning shadows, Miss Vale, is that they rarely emerge in the shape we expect." She glanced at me, then back to him. "I didn't realize truth had learned to lie." "It hasn't," Wolfe said. "People have simply learned how to perform it." She left without another word, and I couldn't tell whether she'd offered us insight or just another draft. Saul Panzer made the call from a payphone near Washington Square. His voice was quiet, but satisfied. "Got something." "What kind of something?" "Fabricated reports. Dr. Harrow, 5 years ago." I didn't ask how he got them. That's why Saul gets the higher rates. They were evaluations, medical, supposedly about Millicent Vale's state of mind, erratic behavior, compulsive narrative distortion, latent paranoia. Except the signatures didn't match and the dates overlapped with a summer when Harrow had been lecturing in Italy. Wolfe read them, then looked up. "She falsified these to build a profile, not for therapy. For publication, a book?" He nodded. "A psychological dissection of genius, marketable, scandalous." "And unethical," I added. "Undoubtedly," he said. "But not illegal, unless someone dies." It wasn't a stretch. A damaged portrait of Millicent could have been sold for cash and notoriety. But to what end? "She wanted to expose her," I said. "No," Wolfe replied. "She wanted to frame her, not in court." In narrative, the line between story and evidence was thinning fast, and Wolfe was not pleased with the prose. The call came at 9:47 p.m. from the 20th Precinct. A body had been pulled from the East River near Pier 40. Male, mid-30s. ID in the coat pocket, Seth Vale. He hadn't gone missing. He'd gone under. Kramer let me see the report before he started yelling. I appreciated the order of operations. The body had been weighted with chain. 2 loops around the chest, 1 around the ankles. The autopsy revealed bruising on the scalp and ribs, consistent with blunt force, but no water in the lungs. Dead before he hit the water, Kramer said, frowning. Dump job. Where's the twist? He didn't answer. He just handed me a small evidence bag. Inside, a gold signet ring. Initials R.E. Ellison's? I asked. Confirmed by his housekeeper. Missing from his dresser since the night he died. I stared at it. So the judge died after Seth? Or Seth stole it, Kramer said. Or they shared a hobby I don't want to know about. I left with the file and the facts. Wolfe, on hearing them, leaned back and closed his eyes. We are not dealing with coincidence, he murmured. We are dealing with choreography. And the dance, it seemed, was far from over. Wolfe sat back in his chair like a judge who already knew the verdict and found the courtroom performance a tedious formality. His fingertips were steepled, and his voice, when it came, was quiet, which meant he was halfway to fury. They have all harmed her, he said, but not in the customary ways. Harmed how? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he listed them, one by one. Leo Hawthorne suppressed a play. Dr. Harrow distorted a profile. Seth Vale poisoned her reputation with innuendo and counterfeit charm. Greta Lawson shredded her credibility with an unsigned review. Judge Ellison, he erased her voice from the public record. I raised an eyebrow. You're calling that a motive for murder? I am calling it, Wolfe replied, a motive for exhibition. Each act was not merely personal, it was editorial. They rewrote her. And she invited them back for a final draft? She summoned them, he said, not to kill, to see, to be seen. He tapped the edge of his desk, a small rhythm of thought. She didn't want justice. She wanted a reckoning, in her own language. And somewhere, I thought, someone had taken that reckoning too literally. There was a design, Wolfe said, but it was not homicidal. He rose from his chair, which in itself marked the seriousness of the claim, and walked precisely 5 steps to the globe where the brandy lived. She orchestrated it like a performance, a narrative in 5 acts, 5 guests, each a transgressor against her authorship. And the curtain rose with a corpse, I said. He turned. Number, the curtain rose with an accusation. Subtle, I muttered. Wolfe poured an inch of brandy, sniffed it, and resumed. She intended confrontation, exposure, not death. Then who added the second act? That, he said, is the point. Someone appropriated her narrative. She built a play. Someone rewrote the ending. I leaned against the bookshelves. You're saying this was literary revenge? I am saying it was narrative control. And it was stolen from her. By whom? Wolfe drained his glass and returned to his chair. That, he said, is what we must now recover. The stolen pen. And once Wolfe starts speaking in metaphor, you know he's warming up for truth. The doorbell rang at exactly 4 minutes past 11, and Fritz came into the office looking like a man delivering news he didn't endorse. Inspector Kramer is here, he said, with the neutrality of a diplomat forced to serve 2 warring nations. Kramer didn't wait for invitation. He entered with the energy of a man dragging thunder behind him, and a folded sheaf of papers in his coat pocket that practically glowed with bureaucratic menace. Wolfe, he barked, she did it. I've got motive, proximity, and a corpse who wore her nephew's ring. Wolfe didn't blink. I assume you are referring to Miss Vale. Don't dance. She brought them together. 2 are dead. Seth was found wearing Judge Ellison's ring. That's not irony, that's evidence. It's coincidence, Wolfe replied calmly. At best. Kramer slapped the warrant on the desk. She's under arrest. Wolfe studied it, then handed it back. You may arrest her, he said, but you will regret it. Is that a threat? Number, it's a prediction. The truth inspector does not kneel to your paperwork. I had to admit. Even Kramer blinked at that one. Kramer stayed. He paced. He growled. He repeated himself, which is never a winning tactic with Wolfe. Wolfe, meanwhile, sat in his chair as though carved from it, eyes half-lidded, lips pursed like a disappointed scholar watching a student flub Latin. Let us suppose, Wolfe said finally, that Miss Vale did engineer the gathering, that she despised them, that she wanted revenge. You have no dispute there. None. Now suppose she wished to punish them. How would she do it? By killing them. Wolfe snorted. Ridiculous. Death is instantaneous. Revenge is not. Revenge lingers, humiliates. It rewrites the power dynamic. Murder is pedestrian. She had motive, Kramer insisted, and opportunity. As does half the literary world? Then who did kill them? I do not yet know, but I know this. Miss Vale's weapon was humiliation, not homicide. Kramer shoved his hat back on. If she didn't do it, you'd better prove it. I intend to, Wolfe said, but not for your benefit. Kramer turned to go, muttering curses I couldn't legally record. As the door closed, Wolfe looked at me. Find Hawthorne. Now? No, next Thursday, he growled. Yes, now. And with that, the play resumed. Leo Hawthorne's rehearsal studio was located 2 floors above a defunct bookstore and smelled of dust, ambition, and one too many closing nights. I found him on stage with a script in one hand and a coffee in the other, both neglected. Mr. Goodwin, he said, as if greeting a miscast understudy. Come to audition? I ignored the bait. I'd like a word. You rarely mean just one. He sat, legs crossed, posture calculated. I sat opposite him, uninvited. We know about the blackmail, I said. He didn't flinch, which told me he'd prepared the performance. She wanted the book buried. I ensured it stayed buried. That's not blackmail, that's literary discretion. You asked for compensation. Emotional, he said smoothly. The manuscript was full of slander. She called me a fraud. I nodded. And you repaid her by keeping her from publication? I offered her the truth. She declined. But you kept the manuscript. He looked away. Some truths don't deserve an audience. Or some audiences know too much, I said. He met my gaze. For a moment, the mask cracked. It was never meant to go this far. I stood. That's what people always say, after the second act ends in blood. He didn't stop me. But I felt the weight of rehearsal in every step I took back to the street. Saul Panzer called just before sunset, with his usual efficiency and lack of drama. She's gone, he said. Dr. Harrow. Gone where? Clinics closed, files burned, receptionists rattled. I found the place an hour later, a 4-story converted townhouse in Murray Hill, now smelling of smoke and bleach. A single window was cracked. The receptionist was a young man with jittery fingers and a smile that didn't reach either eye. She had an emergency, he told me. Didn't we all? I replied. He claimed ignorance. And it wasn't convincing. But fear had already done its editing. Inside, the files had been torched. Half-burnt folders were still curling in the fireplace. The room was clean in the way only guilt or retreat achieves. I called Wolfe. She vanished, I said. Of course, he replied. She wrote her own narrative and now she's erasing it. Any guess where? Wherever she thinks truth can't find her, which means she's wrong. Truth has a long memory and a longer reach. I stood in the silence of scorched paper and wondered how many diagnoses had been rewritten to fit her plot. It was Fritz who brought the package into the office, holding it like it contained either a confession or a bomb. In our line of work, they sometimes amount to the same thing. No return address, no postage cancellation, just a name scrawled across the front, Wolfe. He sliced the wrapping with his thumbnail and removed a thick bundle of manuscript pages half-singed, still smelling faintly of smoke. The title page read, A Play of 5 Deaths. Wolfe didn't touch it at first. He just looked at it as though it had grown teeth. Then he nodded once, and I began reading aloud. It was a play, yes, dialogue, stage directions, carefully blocked scenes. But it wasn't fiction, not entirely. It detailed a dinner, 5 guests, hidden grievances, an offstage death. Wolfe interrupted and stopped. He took the manuscript, flipped 3 pages ahead, and read silently. Then he spoke. This is a confession. From whom? He didn't answer right away. It is not merely admission, it is authorship. Whoever wrote this has claimed the staging, if not yet the blow. Meaning? Meaning, he said, we have our playwright, but not yet our actor. I glanced again at the last page. The final line was underlined in red. The audience never knows what's real until the curtain falls. Wolfe closed the file. And it hasn't yet. She came at noon, which was impolite, and without appointment, which was worse. Fritz intercepted her at the door and sent her in with a look that suggested he'd already tried to block the current and failed. Greta Lawson walked into the office wearing a coat too heavy for the weather and an expression too composed for grief. She sat without asking, folded her hands in her lap, and spoke with the poise of someone who'd rehearsed her confession several times and delivered it twice in the mirror. I killed Judge Ellison. Wolfe didn't so much as blink. Indeed. I poisoned the port. I had access to the bottle earlier. No one saw me. Convenient, Wolfe murmured. Go on. She did, calmly, as though she were reading from a legal deposition that had been typed in a cool room, far from consequence. I watched her more than I listened. She wasn't fidgeting, she wasn't trembling, she was offering Wolfe a solution, neat, framed, and portable, too portable. He waited until she had finished, then asked the only question that mattered. Why now? Her voice didn't waver. Because you already know. No, Wolfe said softly. Because you believe I'll stop looking. That was when I knew she hadn't come to confess. She'd come to end something. Wolfe didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He dismantled Greta's confession the way a botanist peels back a diseased bloom, methodically, without hurry, and with quiet disdain for sentiment. You claim you poisoned the judge's port, he said. And yet you didn't know he took water with his medication, which he did, every night. She blinked. You say you had access to the bottle, but the decanter was opened by the butler, in full view, moments before it was poured. You would have had to dose it before dinner. Risky, improbable. I took the risk, she said. No, he replied. You took the blame, which is different. She swallowed. I saw the tremor then, slight but real. Wolfe continued, what you've done is not confession, it's submission. You are offering guilt in exchange for certainty. That is not justice, that is fatigue. She stood abruptly. You don't believe me. Miss Lawson, Wolfe said, you are many things, but not a murderer. She turned to me then, as if hoping I might contradict him. I didn't. Some lies come in shouting. Hers had come dressed in resignation, and that made them all the more dangerous. After Greta left, not so much dismissed as quietly disassembled, Wolfe sat in silence for the better part of 5 minutes. When he finally spoke, it was with the tone of a man brushing away irrelevant dust. The ring, Archie. I knew which one. Judge Ellison's signet, last seen on Seth Vale's finger underwater. Correct. Why was it there? He could have taken it after the judge died. No, Wolfe said, because the judge did not die when we thought. I paused. You think the time of death? I think the assumption of death is what matters, he interrupted. A man is found dead in a locked room. Later, another man is found actually dead, wearing the first man's ring. What do we call that, Archie? Sloppy symbolism? A message, Wolfe said, but from whom and to whom? I had no answer. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closed. You will investigate Seth's last movements. I want to know how that ring traveled, not just physically but narratively, who saw it, who handled it, and who misunderstood it. I stood. You think the ring isn't just a clue, it's a cue. He opened his eyes. Precisely. And the performance, I fear, is still in progress. The Excelsior's assistant manager had the stiff jaw of a man who had once studied hospitality under a Prussian general. But with the right mixture of flattery, insinuation, and $10 bills, he became unexpectedly conversational. Yes, Mr. Vale was here the day before the... Incident. Anyone visit him? One gentleman, older, distinguished. Did he sign in? No name, but the desk clerk recognized him later, or from the papers. Judge Ellison. So they'd met. Quietly. No witnesses, no calls logged, no room service. Just two men with unfinished history and too many sealed envelopes between them. I checked the room myself. The sheets had been changed, the trash emptied, but the air still carried tension like old cigar smoke. I found a coaster with the hotel's insignia and two faint glass rings on it, one square, one round. They'd talked, and maybe something else. Back at the brownstone, I handed Wolfe my notes. He read, grunted, and murmured. The judge lived longer than his reputation allowed. That means someone needed him to die twice. Once in public, once in truth. I didn't ask what that meant. I just waited for the next deduction. It wasn't far off. Fritz rarely reads fiction. He has no patience for plots that do not resolve in sauce reductions or soufflés. So when I found him in the kitchen, spectacles perched low, frowning over a half-scorched typescript, while his trout stock simmered unloved behind him, I knew the manuscript had teeth. I was merely curious, he said, eyes flicking to me. And mildly appalled. The syntax is deplorable. What's the story? He handed me the half-charred pages. It wasn't titled on the first leaf, but I recognized the name on the spine fragment. A Play of 5 Deaths. Millicent's work, or what was left of it. The prose wasn't bad, it was something worse. Familiar. I skimmed until my eyes snagged on a sentence that stopped the blood in its tracks. The death was not real, it was a rehearsal. Fritz, without prompting, muttered, "I don't like that line." "Neither do I," said, "because it means someone wrote the script before the performance." I brought it to Wolfe, who took it with a reverence reserved for vintage port or damning evidence. He read the sentence once, then again, and said, "Rehearsal indeed." Then the curtain rose. And I knew we were no longer looking at a murder. We were looking at a play that ended in blood. There's a particular silence Wolfe keeps in his office. It's not the peaceful kind. It hums, it breathes. It's the silence of machinery too deep to hear, but powerful enough to tilt the room. He maintained that silence for 7 minutes, reading and rereading the manuscript's fragmented lines. Then he spoke. It was not death. It was imitation. I raised an eyebrow, which for me is equivalent to shouting. "You think the judge was faking?" "I think he was made to fake," Wolfe replied. Drugged, rendered unresponsive, laid out to appear as though the performance had ended, when in fact the act had just begun. I leaned against the desk. "And the actual murder?" "Occurred later, quietly, after the curtain fell." He tapped the edge of the paper with a single thick finger. "This play, this draft, now it is not allegory, it is instruction. Someone used this text as a blueprint. The dinner was Act 1, an illusion. The killing, Act 2, reality." I frowned. "Why fake it first?" "To test the room," Wolfe said. "To see how the cast responded, who panicked, who stayed still, who knew." "And who didn't?" I added. Wolfe nodded. "And more crucially, who couldn't tell the difference between a performance and a crime." The line between theatre and murder had blurred. Wolfe had just drawn it back in ink. And we were standing on the wrong side of the stage. Kramer doesn't like being wrong. He likes being contradicted even less. So when he returned that evening, thick overcoat flapping like a disapproving curtain and medical folder in hand, I knew we were in for either an apology or a detonation. He opted for the latter. "You're lucky this makes no damn sense," he said, flinging the report onto Wolfe's desk. "The judge was alive during dessert. The coroner's revised estimate puts the time of death between 2 and 3 in the morning, long after your guests had departed." Wolfe, who had been delicately sipping a chilled Riesling, nodded without visible pleasure. "I accept your confirmation." Kramer glared. "That means one of your precious artistes returned to the scene." "Or never truly left," Wolfe replied. Kramer grunted and turned to me. And you don't think this gets you off the hook? I smiled. Wouldn't dream of it. After he stormed out, Wolfe said quietly, "The illusion was exquisite. The audience believed it, even the actors. But only one person knew the script well enough to rewrite the ending. And as I filed the report away, I realized we had one more act to go, and this time no one would be clapping." Wolfe leaned back, his eyes half-lidded in that particular state of inertia that meant his mind was on fire. He didn't speak at first. Didn't need to. The silence had a way of cracking under its own weight when he was thinking, and I let it. "The judge did not die at midnight," he said, finally. He exited. I raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. That, I've learned, is like putting a speed bump on a racetrack, unwise and unproductive. "It was a performance," Wolfe went on. "A simulation, calculated to remove him from observation. He was drugged, not dead. The arrangement of his body, the convenient timing, the gasps, all carefully rehearsed. And the author? Millicent? Number, she may have held the pen, but she did not write that scene. Someone else directed the curtain." His gaze landed on the manuscript, that half-burned relic of someone's theatrical fever dream. "Seth Vale," Wolfe murmured, "was the only one who saw through it. And so he was given his own scene, a final act, unplanned and fatal." Wolfe shifted slightly. "We are no longer in a drawing room, Archie. This is a stage, and someone has lost control of the script. Wolfe doesn't issue invitations. He issues gravity, the kind you don't escape without consequences. So when he dictated a formal request for the remaining guests to assemble at the brownstone, I knew what was coming. Act 3. The responses were prompt, all but one. Millicent Langford replied through her assistant, unavailable, indisposed, and uninterested. That was her first mistake. "She must come," Wolfe said, without lifting his gaze from the manuscript. "The narrative requires her." "You want me to drag her in with a net?" I asked. "No," he said. "Saul," which meant business. Saul Panzer was discretion, persuasion, and inevitability rolled into one grey suit. If he was sent to fetch Millicent, she'd be here, her excuses folded and filed somewhere in his back pocket. Wolfe leaned back. "Without her presence, the climax falters. We are not improvising, Archie. We are restoring structure." And with that, the wheels were set in motion. The guests were coming. The brownstone was ready. Wolfe was composing the final scene, and he wouldn't need to leave his chair to deliver it. The manuscript was an abomination, not just in taste, but in intimacy. Half-scorched, but too revealing to dismiss as fiction. I read the title again, A Play of 5 Deaths. Someone had written it with knowledge they shouldn't have had, or worse, with a desire to make it real. "Note the structure," Wolfe said. Tapping a page, Fritz had flattened between parchment and iron. "Characters indistinct from our dinner guests, dialogue plagiarized from life." "And this line," I pointed, "the jurist shall fall first, to break the pact of silence. That's not art, that's autobiography." "More damning," Wolfe murmured, "is the date on the cover page. It predates the event. This was not post-factum fantasy, it was prophecy." I turned another page and stopped. "Here," I said, "the names have been altered slightly. Millicent becomes Clarissa, Seth is Simon, but the lines, they're too precise." Wolfe's gaze sharpened. "Then we must ask ourselves, who had both access and ambition? Who believed performance would cloak truth? And who thought murder could be made beautiful?" The answer wasn't on the page, but it was in the room, waiting to hear their lines read back to them. They came because they couldn't afford not to. When Wolfe calls you in for Act 3, you don't rehearse. You show up and hope the script has mercy. Greta, pale and threadbare, Leo adjusting his tie too often, and Kramer leaning against the bookcase like he'd been assigned a part and didn't like the lines. Wolfe opened with no preamble. "You have all acted," he said, "though none of you knew your role completely." Silence. Then Leo. "Is this a trial?" "No," Wolfe said. "A reading." He lifted the manuscript. Exhibit A, a play, authored anonymously, yet intimately. Names veiled, but not hidden. Motives obscured, but not fictionalized. Judge Ellison's staged collapse. Seth Vale's inconvenient intuition. The playwright's design unraveling when the cast refused to follow. He paused. The question is not who killed, but who directed. Greta's breath caught. Millicent stared at the fire like it owed her something. Leo blinked once, twice, but said nothing. Wolfe's voice softened. "You came here tonight to hear a story. You thought it would end with applause or maybe forgiveness, but the lights are up now." And in that bare illumination, no one could hide their part. Leo Hawthorne had always played the modest genius. The man behind the scenes, allergic to fame but immune to obscurity. He wasn't used to being cast in the spotlight without his consent. Wolfe gave him no script. "You wrote the manuscript," Wolfe said, not a question. Leo smiled. "You assume much." "I deduce," Wolfe replied. "And I do so from evidence, not whim. You staged the judge's collapse, a chemical soporific, administered in his wineglass, procured by your acquaintance in pharmaceuticals." Leo's fingers twitched. Wolfe didn't stop. Seth Vale recognized the trick. His familiarity with dramatic structure made him see what the others missed. He confronted you, not out of righteousness, but out of curiosity. And for that you rewarded him with a fall from the stage. Greta gasped. Millicent's mouth opened, then shut. Leo's voice was a whisper. "You don't understand." "I understand art," Wolfe said, "and ego and retribution. You orchestrated this not merely to settle a score, but to write your own legend, with ink and blood." Leo didn't reply. But the silence was louder than guilt, and twice as damning. Wolfe had no need to raise his voice. Truth, when it has been cornered, speaks quietly. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said, "your motive is not linear. It is layered, and that makes it dangerous." Leo sat frozen, no longer performing. Wolfe continued. "You sought revenge for professional betrayal, Millicent's rejection of your script, her success at your expense, but it evolved. You wanted something deeper, to prove that your vision could command reality, that life could be coaxed, even tricked, into theatre." He paused. "The judge became your first puppet. Seth, your unintended casualty. Millicent, the muse you intended to humble." Leo's hands were trembling now, not with rage, but with something worse. Recognition. "You did not kill out of rage," Wolfe concluded. "You killed to direct the story." And with that the audience, all of us, understood. This was not a crime of passion, it was a production. And Wolfe had brought down the curtain. Millicent rose. She had said nothing during Wolfe's monologue, no protest, no plea. Just a long, internal stillness, like someone watching her own portrait being painted stroke by unflattering stroke. She walked slowly to the hearth. The manuscript rested there, brittle and accusing. She picked it up. "Understanding," she said, "is not always welcome. But tonight, it is earned." She didn't look at Leo, nor at Wolfe, nor at me. Just at the fire. Then she dropped the pages in. They flared fast, dry as old lies, and the flames climbed as if the truth itself was flammable. Wolfe cleared his throat. "You may wish to preserve—" "No," Millicent interrupted. "Let it burn." She turned to Wolfe. "You understood more than the crime. You saw the performance and refused to applaud." He inclined his head just slightly. As the last corner of the script curled into ember, Millicent whispered, "Thank you for not mistaking art for justice." Then she sat again, composed. The fire crackled behind her, and in that quiet, the only thing left unspoken was applause. Wolfe had not spoken for 47 minutes. He had retreated to the orchid room, his ritual sanctum, where justice is not blind but photosynthetic. The scent in there, warm, exotic, almost artificial in its perfection, had never struck me as ironic until that afternoon. From where I stood in the doorway, I could see him adjusting a wire trellis with a delicacy that would have made a Swiss watchmaker feel coarse. If you asked him whether the conclusion of the Hawthorne affair satisfied him, he'd have said yes, and meant it. But satisfaction isn't the same as peace. I cleared my throat. He didn't look up. "Do not disturb the air, Archie. These blossoms rely on constancy." "Like justice?" "No," Wolfe said. "Justice tolerates interruption. What it cannot abide is pretense." I shut up. When a man quotes philosophy to a petal, it's best to let him. But I'll say this. The manuscript had burned, the killer had confessed, the curtain had closed, and yet the only thing blooming in that room was something Wolfe didn't name. Maybe justice had been done, but no one, not even Wolfe, was pretending it smelled sweet. Greta Lawson left the way you'd expect a woman to leave who once thought she could shoulder guilt like a coat, quietly, badly, and with her collar turned up against the world. I saw her once more, from a distance, at Penn Station. She carried no luggage, just a handbag, and the kind of expression that makes a porter think twice before offering help. She didn't cry, didn't look back, didn't tip the newsboy who handed her a paper with a headline about someone else's sins. Wolfe had offered her no reprieve, only truth. And truth, as I've learned, doesn't always come with absolution, only release. The station clock ticked, the train pulled in. Greta stepped aboard. I watched her silhouette vanish into the car, then the car into the tunnel. No fanfare, no second act, just another ghost on steel wheels. She had come seeking punishment and found perspective instead, which might be the crueler gift. But for what it's worth, she didn't leave empty-handed. She took her memories and a name whispered in the dark. If Millicent Vale had any talent greater than performance, it was disappearance. Not the dramatic kind. No vanishing powder, no cloak and dagger, just the steady art of receding until even her silhouette became speculative. Wolfe once said that certain people are not shaped by events but by the shadows they cast. Millicent, I suspect, cast hers in advance. After Leo's arrest, she gave no interviews. She declined every invitation, including one from a literary journal that wanted a feature titled Muse or Manipulator. She mailed back the request with one word, written in violet ink, neither. Her apartment was vacated by the end of the week. The doorman couldn't say where she'd gone, only that she'd paid 3 months ahead and left no forwarding address. The piano remained untouched, and the manuscript was ashes in the grate. When I mentioned her vanishing act to Wolfe, he shrugged, a rare movement. "She has performed the one act she never rehearsed," he said. "She has become silent." And in that silence, her legend reassembled itself. Not with applause, but with questions that no one would dare ask aloud. Inspector Kramer arrived with the scent of tobacco and resignation, which was how I knew this would be a cordial visit. By his standards. Wolfe, of course, did not rise. He nodded once, which Kramer returned, with the kind of stiff acknowledgement that suggested a man checking his watch while giving thanks. "You were right," Kramer said. "Leo Hawthorne confessed. In writing, no less. It'll hold." "I am pleased," Wolfe replied, though not surprised. Kramer grunted. "That manuscript, damnedest thing I've seen. Reads like Hamlet had a head cold and a grudge." I offered him coffee, which he declined. He stood instead, arms folded, scanning the room like it might still yield a suspect under the rug. "You don't make it easy," he muttered. "But this one, well, credit where due." He turned to go, then hesitated at the door. "You ever think of coming in to work for us full-time?" "No," Wolfe said flatly. "Didn't think so." And with that, Midtown's finest retreated, not with applause, not even with civility, but with something rarer, admission. In Wolfe's book, that was almost as sweet as justice. Almost. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, fingers laced across his stomach, in a pose that suggested satisfaction, though not repose. The manuscript was gone, the curtain had long fallen, but his mind had not left the stage. It was not a tragedy, he said, as though addressing the ceiling. A tragedy implies inevitability. This was theatre, deliberate, crafted, and executed with precision. Even the corpses? I asked. He gave me a look, the kind that could flavour a pot roast with disdain. Yes, Mr. Goodwin, even the corpses. Every player knew his lines. Some chose improvisation. That is the danger of art, its capacity to imitate life too precisely. I didn't argue. Wolfe rarely mistook his metaphors. There is no justice in theatre, he added, closing his eyes. Only applause or silence. And in life? In life, he said, we pretend the applause matters more. I let him be. He wasn't mourning the victims. He was acknowledging the performance. And in a way, he wasn't wrong. Every lie told in that house had a script, a cue, and an exit. Only the truth had to improvise. And somehow, it stole the scene. In the days that followed, I couldn't help tallying the score, not in blood, but in baggage. Of the 5 guests invited to Millicent's little soirée, 3 left with their names intact. Or mostly intact. The other 2, well, Seth was underwater, and Leo was under lock and key, but free was a relative term. No one emerged from that drawing room unbruised. Take Greta Lawson. Her confession had been a performance, yes, but not entirely dishonest. She had wanted guilt, needed it. Wolfe, in his usual parlour logic, had denied her the luxury. That kind of truth lingers like smoke. You can wash your clothes, but you'll smell it weeks later. Then there was Millicent herself. If silence was a verdict, she got it. She didn't break down, she didn't explain, she just vanished again, leaving behind the faint scent of ink, old perfume, and a legacy polished by controversy. The others? They left. They resumed careers, relationships, dinner reservations. But the knowledge lingered. They had been suspects in a murder. And worse, they had each brought something dark to the table. Innocence, Wolfe once said, is not a lack of guilt, it's a lack of opportunity. That night, everyone had the opportunity. Some just didn't take the final bow. Fritz outdid himself that night, and that's saying something. The trout à la Genevoise was so delicate it practically curtsied. I did my part by not speaking until the last forkful was gone, and Wolfe did his by not insulting me while I ate. That's called harmony. Afterward we moved to the office, that sacred space where crimes get dissected like frogs in a high school lab. Wolfe opened a bottle of Remmers. He said beer was the appropriate punctuation to truth, and I pulled out my notes. "Will you write it up?" he asked, lifting his brows the barest quarter-inch. "Already started?" I said, though it's a tough one to title. Murderer's Rehearsal? The Last Line of the Dead? Or maybe just the curtain call? He grunted. "You are too fond of drama." "That makes 2 of us." He didn't reply, which in Wolfe's lexicon meant concession. I scribbled the last few details, closed the folder, and leaned back. The room felt oddly full, like ghosts had been cleared out to make space for quiet. Fritz cleared the plates. Wolfe reached for a book. I reached for a pen, and just like that the house exhaled. Casebook closed, silence restored. The next morning, I sat in the office alone, reading the last line of my report aloud to no one in particular. Sometimes the spotlight hides more than it shows, and murder, like art, is all in the staging. It wasn't profound, but it was true. People wear masks on stage and off, and not all scripts are written in ink. Some are written in silence, in glances, in grudges wrapped in monologues. Wolfe would scoff. But I filed it away anyway. Cases end, curtains fall, but the lights don't go out. Not really, they just shift to someone else. And so the curtain falls on a performance none of them intended, yet all of them helped stage. The judge is gone, Greta's guilt dissolved like fog, and Millicent's silence speaks louder than any confession. Wolfe, as ever, dissects the world from his chair. But even he admits, perhaps privately, that reason can't always account for the theatre of the human soul. Do you believe truth can be revealed without destroying someone's part in the story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.